My dad called me panicking. The IRS is seizing our house. We need $30,000 today. I liquidated my emergency fund and wired the money. 3 weeks later, I drove by their house and saw a brand new BMW in the driveway. I called the IRS. There was never any lien. I reported the fraud and had the car repossessed. Dad's been calling me Vindictive ever since. I, 34M, thought I was saving my parents' house from the IRS. Turns out, I was funding their luxury car purchase instead. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. My phone buzzed against the nightstand, and Dad's name flashed across the screen. He never called this early unless something was seriously wrong. Dad's voice was shaking when I picked up. He told me the IRS had put a lien on their house, and they needed $30,000 by end of business, or they'd lose everything. His words tumbled out in a panicked rush. Something about back taxes from 2019, penalties compounding, and the agent giving them one final chance to settle before seizure proceedings began. My stomach dropped. My parents had been struggling financially since Dad's early retirement 3 years ago. Mom's part-time job at the library barely covered groceries, and I knew they'd been dipping into their savings just to make mortgage payments. This felt like the inevitable disaster we'd all been dreading. Dad explained that their accountant had made some mistakes on their 2019 return, claiming deductions they weren't eligible for. The IRS had audited them, found the errors, and now wanted everything back with interest and penalties. He said they'd been trying to work out a payment plan for months, but the agent assigned to their case was being unreasonable. He sounded defeated when he told me they'd already liquidated their retirement accounts to pay the first installment, but it wasn't enough. The agent had given them until 5 p.m. that day to come up with the remaining balance or face immediate property seizure. Dad's voice cracked as he said they had nowhere else to turn. I didn't hesitate. These were my parents, the people who'd sacrificed everything to put me through college, who'd never asked me for a dime, even when times got tough. If they needed $30,000 to keep their house, I'd find a way to get it. My emergency fund had exactly $32,000. I'd been building it for 5 years, adding every bonus and tax refund with the discipline of a monk. It was supposed to be untouchable, my safety net for job loss, medical emergencies, or major home repairs. But this was bigger than any of that. This was my family's home. I told Dad I'd handle it and asked for the wire transfer information. He gave me the account details through tears, promising they'd pay me back as soon as they got back on their feet. I assured him not to worry about repayment. We were family, and family helps family. The bank manager looked skeptical when I walked in requesting a $30,000 wire transfer. She asked multiple times if I was sure, explaining that wire transfers were irreversible and suggesting I consider a cashier's check instead. I appreciated her concern, but Dad had been clear that the IRS required a wire transfer for immediate processing. By noon, the money was gone. Dad called 20 minutes later, sobbing with relief. He said the IRS agent had confirmed receipt and that the lien would be lifted within 24 hours. I felt good about what I'd done, even as my bank balance showed a measly $2,000 where my life savings used to be. The next few weeks passed normally. Dad called twice to thank me again and promised they were working with a new accountant to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Mom sent a handwritten card expressing her gratitude and saying how proud they were to have raised such a generous son. Everything seemed back to normal. 3 weeks later, I was driving through their neighborhood after a client meeting. I debated stopping by but decided against it. I didn't want them to feel awkward about the money situation. But as I passed their street, curiosity got the better of me, and I took a detour past their house. That's when I saw it. A gleaming black BMW X5 sat in their driveway, like a monument to betrayal. The temporary dealer plates were still attached, meaning it was brand new. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. I pulled over 2 houses down and stared. There was no mistake. This was definitely their driveway, their house, their new luxury SUV. The base model X5 started at $60,000. Even used, you weren't getting into one for less than 40 grand. My phone was in my hand before I'd consciously decided to call Dad. When he answered, his voice had the cheerful tone of someone enjoying their retirement, not the stressed panic of someone barely scraping by. I asked about the BMW as casually as I could manage. Dad's pause lasted 3 seconds too long before he launched into an explanation about Mom needing reliable transportation and finding an incredible deal at the dealership. He said they'd been planning this purchase for months and had finally pulled the trigger using some money Mom's sister had left her. I'd met Mom's sister exactly once, at their anniversary party 2 years ago. She was a bitter woman who'd spent the entire evening complaining about her cheapskate children and how she planned to leave her money to charity rather than family. The idea of her leaving Mom anything substantial enough for a luxury car purchase was absurd. After hanging up, I sat in my car staring at that BMW for 20 minutes. The timeline was too convenient. The IRS crisis 3 weeks ago, followed immediately by a $60,000 car purchase. Either my parents had the worst timing in financial history, or I'd been played. The next morning, I called the IRS directly. After navigating their phone system for 45 minutes, I finally reached a human being who could access taxpayer information. I explained that I was calling about my parents' case and provided their names and social security numbers. The agent put me on hold for 10 minutes. When she returned, her tone was confused. She told me there was no record of any lien, seizure proceedings, or outstanding debt for my parents. Their 2019 return had been filed correctly and on time. There had never been an audit. They owed the government exactly $0. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. The room started spinning as the full scope of their deception hit me. They'd fabricated an entire crisis, the IRS agent, the lien, the seizure threat, even the timeline, to trick me into funding their car purchase. $30,000 of my emergency fund had gone directly into their luxury vehicle down payment. They'd looked me in the eye, cried real tears, and sold me a completely fabricated sob story to steal my life savings. I called a lawyer that afternoon. He listened to my story with the patience of someone who'd heard variations of family financial fraud many times before. He explained that what my parents had done constituted wire fraud, a federal crime punishable by up to 20 years in prison. He also said civil recovery was possible if I wanted to pursue it. The lawyer helped me file a complaint with both the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center and local police. The detective assigned to the case was sympathetic but warned that family financial crimes were often difficult to prosecute, especially when no written contracts existed. 2 days later, I was back at the BMW dealership with a folder full of documentation. I explained the situation to the sales manager, that the vehicle had been purchased with fraudulently obtained funds and that I was the victim seeking recovery. I provided bank records showing my wire transfer, phone records of the fabricated emergency call, and the IRS documentation proving no lien had ever existed. The sales manager reviewed everything carefully before disappearing into a back office for 30 minutes. When he returned, he was accompanied by the dealership's legal counsel. They asked detailed questions about the timeline, the wire transfer, and the police report I'd filed. Within 48 hours, they'd made their decision. The BMW was repossessed on a Thursday morning while Dad was getting his hair cut and Mom was at the grocery store. The timing wasn't coincidental. I'd provided the dealership with their typical schedules to minimize public embarrassment. Dad's first call came 6 hours later. Gone was any pretense of the confused, grateful father. His voice was ice cold as he accused me of being vindictive and cruel. He said families were supposed to forgive each other's mistakes, not involve lawyers and law enforcement over money. I asked him to clarify what mistake he thought had occurred. Dad's explanation was a masterpiece of deflection and gaslighting. He claimed they genuinely believed they owed the IRS money based on something their old accountant had said. He insisted the BMW purchase was completely unrelated, just unfortunate timing that made everything look suspicious. When I pointed out that the IRS had no record of any communication with them whatsoever, Dad's story shifted again. Now it was all Mom's fault. She'd misunderstood something she'd read online and panicked. He'd simply been trying to calm her down and had gotten caught up in her hysteria. I asked about the specific wire transfer instructions, the detailed story about penalties and seizure proceedings, and the tearful gratitude calls afterward. Dad grew quiet before launching into a speech about how successful kids sometimes forgot where they came from and how disappointing it was to see me choose money over family relationships. The conversation ended with Dad telling me I'd crossed a line by involving outsiders in family business. He said real sons would have handled this privately and that my actions had humiliated them in front of their neighbors and friends. Mom called the next day with a different approach. She cried through most of the conversation, apologizing for what she called a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. She claimed Dad had been trying to protect her from financial stress and had exaggerated the IRS situation to avoid admitting how bad their money problems really were. According to Mom's version, they'd been planning to tell me the truth and pay back the money once Dad found part-time work. The BMW purchase was supposedly Mom's emotional reaction to the stress, a retail therapy purchase she immediately regretted. She begged me to drop the police report and work things out as a family. I might have been more sympathetic if they'd tried this approach initially. But after weeks of lies, followed by Dad's cold anger when caught, Mom's sudden remorse felt like another manipulation attempt. The police investigation wrapped up 2 weeks later. The detective explained that while my parents had clearly committed fraud, the district attorney's office was unlikely to pursue criminal charges for a first-time offense between family members where partial restitution had occurred through the car repossession. However, the civil case moved forward smoothly. My lawyer filed suit for the full $30,000 plus legal fees and court costs. My parents' attorney, paid for with money they claimed not to have, tried to negotiate a settlement, but I refused anything less than full repayment. The case never went to trial. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the certainty of losing, my parents agreed to a payment plan requiring them to repay $35,000 over 18 months. The extra $5,000 covered my legal fees and the financial disruption they'd caused. 6 months later, they've made every payment on schedule. Dad sends the monthly check with no accompanying note or communication. Mom has called twice trying to rebuild our relationship, but our conversations feel hollow and forced. The trust that took 34 years to build was destroyed in a single fabricated phone call. Update 1. The monthly payments continued like clockwork for the full 18 months. Dad never missed a deadline, though the checks arrived with the punctuality of someone fulfilling a court order rather than a family obligation. No birthday cards, no holiday calls, no attempts at reconciliation beyond Mom's occasional awkward phone conversations. Last month, I received the final payment along with something unexpected, a 2-page letter from Dad. His handwriting, usually neat and controlled, looked shaky and uncertain. He wrote that he'd finally understood why I'd reacted the way I did, and that he was ashamed of what they'd done. He admitted the entire IRS story had been fabricated from the beginning and that they'd convinced themselves I'd never find out. Dad explained they'd been living beyond their means since his retirement, racking up credit card debt, trying to maintain their previous lifestyle. The BMW wasn't an impulse purchase. They'd been planning it for months, but couldn't qualify for financing due to their debt-to-income ratio. My emergency fund had seemed like the perfect solution to their problems. He said they'd told themselves they were borrowing, not stealing, and that they'd find a way to pay me back before I noticed. In Dad's mind, the elaborate IRS deception was somehow more honorable than simply asking for a loan, because it positioned them as victims rather than people who'd made poor financial choices. The letter's final paragraph was the closest thing to a real apology I'd received. Dad wrote that he'd spent the past 2 years thinking I was vindictive and cruel, but he'd recently realized I'd actually shown remarkable restraint. He said a stranger would have pressed criminal charges without hesitation, and that my decision to pursue only civil recovery had probably saved him from federal prison. Update 2. 3 weeks after Dad's letter arrived, Mom called with news that changed everything. Dad had suffered a massive heart attack and was in intensive care. Despite everything that had happened between us, I drove straight to the hospital. Seeing him hooked up to machines, looking fragile and small in the hospital bed, put our conflict into perspective. Whatever anger I'd been carrying felt insignificant compared to the possibility of losing him permanently. Mom and I sat in the waiting room for hours, talking more honestly than we had in 2 years. She told me the full truth about their financial situation. Dad's early retirement hadn't been voluntary. His company had eliminated his position and offered a buyout that seemed generous at the time. They'd assumed they could live comfortably on their savings and his Social Security, but inflation and unexpected medical expenses had eaten through their nest egg faster than anticipated. The shame of their situation had prevented them from asking for help directly. In Dad's generation, parents were supposed to be the ones helping their adult children, not the other way around. The IRS scam had felt like a way to get the money they needed while preserving their dignity, at least in their own minds. Mom also revealed something that recontextualized their behavior entirely. Dad had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months before the BMW incident. His financial judgment had been deteriorating gradually, leading to increasingly irrational decisions and elaborate justifications for those decisions. The IRS scheme wasn't just greed. It was partially the result of a man whose cognitive abilities were declining. Dad survived the heart attack, but faced a long recovery. The medical bills were staggering, even with Medicare coverage. Without discussion or fanfare, I quietly paid the outstanding balance on his hospital stay. Some things were more important than money or wounded pride. Update 3. It's been 18 months since Dad's heart attack, and our relationship has slowly rebuilt itself on a foundation of brutal honesty rather than comfortable lies. His dementia diagnosis forced all of us to confront the reality that our time together was limited and precious. Dad's cognitive decline has been gradual but noticeable. He struggles with complex financial concepts now and relies on Mom for most major decisions. Ironically, this has made him more honest about their situation rather than less. The elaborate deceptions require a level of mental energy he no longer possesses. I've taken over managing their finances completely. The money I recovered through the lawsuit went directly into a trust account that covers their monthly expenses and medical costs. They'll never have to worry about making rent or paying for groceries. But they also can't make any major purchases without my approval. This arrangement might sound controlling, but it's actually liberated all of us from the cycle of financial deception. Dad doesn't have to maintain the pretense of financial stability. Mom doesn't have to enable his poor decisions, and I don't have to wonder if their latest crisis is real or fabricated. The BMW incident taught me that unconditional family loyalty can be a weakness when it enables destructive behavior. But it also showed me that love sometimes requires setting boundaries, even when those boundaries feel harsh or vindictive to others. Dad still calls me vindictive sometimes, usually when his dementia makes him forget why certain restrictions exist. But in his clearer moments, he admits that my response to their fraud probably saved them from much worse consequences. The discipline required to repay that money forced them to confront their spending problems and seek help before their situation became completely unsalvageable. Looking back, I don't regret reporting the fraud or pursuing recovery of my money. Family doesn't mean accepting abuse or manipulation without consequences. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when they hate you for it. The trust between us will never be what it once was, but we've built something new. A relationship based on clear expectations and honest communication rather than comfortable myths and enabling behaviors. It's not the family dynamic I'd have chosen, but it's sustainable in a way our previous relationship wasn't. My emergency fund is rebuilt and stronger than ever. But more importantly, I learned that some emergencies can't be solved by throwing money at them. Sometimes the real emergency is learning to say no to people you love when they're making decisions that will ultimately destroy them.